November 2026. That's the month Edgar Cayce circled in his prophecies over 80 years ago. A month when, according to the sleeping prophet, Donald Trump would face something no one could predict, something that would shock his supporters and his opponents equally. And here's the thing that makes your spine tingle. Cayce died in 1945, before Trump was even born, yet he described events so precise, so specific to this moment, that researchers are scrambling to understand how he saw it coming. Think about that for a second. A man lying on a couch in Virginia Beach in the 1940s, speaking in a trance state, describing events that wouldn't happen for more than 8 decades. Not vague generalities about trouble ahead, but specific markers, specific patterns, specific timing. November 2026 comes up again and again in readings about America's future. And when you understand what Cayce saw happening in that month, when you see how the pieces are lining up right now in October 2025, it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. What did he see exactly? What makes November 2026 the pivotal point? And why are people who have studied Cayce's work for decades suddenly warning everyone to pay attention? Why are researchers who spent their entire careers analyzing these prophecies now saying, "This is it! This is the moment Cayce was talking about"? Stay with me, because what unfolds here will change how you see everything happening right now in American politics. It will change how you understand the chaos of the last few years. And it might just change how you prepare for what's coming in the next 12 months. The story begins not in 2026, not even in 2016 when Trump first ran for president, but in a small office in Virginia Beach more than 80 years ago. The year was 1943. America was deep into World War II. Young men were dying on beaches in the Pacific and in frozen foxholes across Europe. Families huddled around radios, listening for news of their sons. The entire world seemed to be tearing itself apart. Let me take you back to Virginia Beach, 1943. Edgar Cayce lies on a couch in his study, eyes closed, breathing steady. His secretary sits ready with her stenography pad. The room is quiet, except for the scratch of her pen and Cayce's slow, measured breathing. Outside, World War II is raging. American boys are dying on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific. The entire world is consumed by the present crisis, by the immediate horror of global conflict. But someone in the room asks about America's future, about the trials the nation will face not in the coming months or years, but in the coming decades, about what will happen when this war is over and new challenges emerge. And Cayce, in his trance state, begins to speak. His voice is calm, almost monotone, but the words are startling. He talks about cycles, about patterns that repeat through history. He describes a period in the mid-2020s when America would face its greatest constitutional test since the Civil War. Then he says something that makes everyone in the room lean forward. He mentions a specific November, roughly 80 years into the future, when everything would come to a head. When all the forces he's describing, all the patterns and cycles, would converge in a single moment of crisis and opportunity. He speaks for nearly an hour, describing details that seem impossible to know, events that seem too far away to predict. But his secretary records every word, just as she has for thousands of other readings. The reading was cataloged as number 3976-26. It sat in the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment for decades. Researchers studied it, debated it, tried to understand its symbolism. Some thought Cayce was speaking metaphorically. Others believed he was describing actual events but got the timing wrong. The reading mentioned towers falling, gold losing its luster, a builder who would try to restore what was lost
but would instead accelerate what was ending. For decades, no one could make sense of it. But it wasn't until 2015, when Trump announced his candidacy, that certain researchers started connecting the dots. The pieces Cayce described, the archetypes, the patterns, they all started lining up with one person. And suddenly, a reading given 72 years earlier began to make perfect sense. The towers weren't just metaphors. The builder wasn't just a symbol. The gold wasn't just about economics. Cayce had seen something specific, someone specific, and now that person was here. Now, before we go further, let me be crystal clear about who Edgar Cayce was. This wasn't some charlatan making vague predictions for money. This wasn't a carnival fortune teller reading palms for spare change. Cayce was a devout Christian, a Sunday school teacher from Hopkinsville, Kentucky. He taught photography for a living. He was soft-spoken, humble, deeply uncomfortable with his own abilities. He would rather have lived a quiet life taking family portraits than become known as a prophet. He discovered his ability by accident when he was 21 years old. He lost his voice completely, couldn't speak above a whisper for months. Doctors couldn't help him. His career as a photographer was in jeopardy. Then someone suggested he try hypnosis. Under hypnosis, Cayce began to describe his own condition in medical terms he'd never heard before. He prescribed a treatment, a series of suggestions to give himself while in trance. When he came out of the hypnotic state and followed his own prescription, his voice returned within days. The local doctors were baffled. How did this man with no medical training accurately describe what was wrong with his own vocal cords and suggest a treatment they hadn't thought of?
A doctor named Al Lane asked if Cayce could do the same thing for his patients. Reluctantly, deeply uncomfortable with the whole thing, Cayce agreed to try. What happened next changed everything. Cayce would lie down on a couch, loosen his tie and belt, fold his hands over his stomach, and close his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing would slow and deepen. Someone would give him the name and location of the patient, sometimes someone in the same room, sometimes someone hundreds of miles away. And then Cayce would begin speaking in a voice slightly different from his normal voice, using medical terminology he'd never studied, describing diseases in Latin terms he didn't know when awake. He would describe what was wrong with the patient in detail, explain how the condition developed, and prescribe treatments. And they worked. Patients who had been suffering for years would follow his recommendations and get better. Doctors started documenting his cases, keeping careful records, trying to understand how this was possible. They would verify his diagnoses through surgery or autopsy and find he was correct down to the smallest detail. One case involved a young girl who had been having seizures for years. Multiple doctors had examined her, tried different treatments. Nothing worked. Cayce, in trance, described a problem with her spine caused by a fall she'd had as a toddler. He said a specific vertebra was out of alignment, pressing on nerves that affected her brain. He prescribed a series of spinal adjustments in a specific pattern. The family found a chiropractor willing to try it. After 3 weeks of treatments exactly as Cayce described, the seizures stopped. They never came back. Another case involved a man dying of stomach cancer. Doctors had given him weeks to live. Cayce described the cancer and then prescribed a treatment involving diet changes, specific herbs, and a series of castor oil packs applied to the abdomen. The man's family figured they had nothing to lose. 3 months later, the man went back to his doctor for what he thought would be his final examination. The doctor couldn't find the cancer. It was gone. The man lived another 23 years. Stories like these multiplied. People came from everywhere seeking help, and Cayce, always reluctant about his gift, always uncomfortable being in the spotlight, spent his life giving readings while in a sleep state. He never charged set fees, accepting only donations. Many people couldn't pay anything, and he helped them anyway. He never claimed to understand how it worked. He simply knew that when he entered trance, information came through him from somewhere he couldn't explain. Over 14,000 readings were recorded between 1901 and 1944. Every single one was transcribed by stenographers, every word documented. This wasn't folklore or oral tradition that changed with each teller.
This was hard documentation, records you can still go to Virginia Beach and read today. The Association for Research and Enlightenment maintains these archives, has digitized most of them, allows researchers from around the world to study them. Medical doctors documented cases where Cayce diagnosed conditions he had no medical training to understand. He would describe tumors in locations doctors couldn't see until they operated and found exactly what Cayce had said. He talked about viruses before virology was fully understood as a science. He described the endocrine system and its functions before medical science had mapped it completely. He prescribed treatments that didn't exist yet but were later proven effective decades after his death. But Cayce wasn't just doing medical readings. He gave life readings where he would describe people's past lives, their karmic patterns, their soul's purpose. He gave business readings, advising people on investments and ventures, and he gave readings about the future, about coming events, about the destiny of nations. These prophecy readings are what we're focusing on today, and they're what has researchers so concerned right now in late 2025. He predicted both world wars before they started. In 1935, when most Americans believed Europe's problems wouldn't affect them, Cayce gave a reading about coming conflict. He described Germany invading Poland, described Japan attacking American interests in the Pacific, described a war that would engulf the entire world. He said it would start in 1939 and last until the mid-1940s. People thought he was crazy. 4 years later, Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. He described the stock market crash of 1929 in detail months before it happened. In the spring of 1929, when everyone was making money hand over fist in the stock market, when people were borrowing money to buy more stocks because prices only went up, Cayce warned people to get out. He said the market was built on false foundations, that a reckoning was coming, that people should sell everything and hold cash. Most ignored him. They thought he was being overly pessimistic. The market kept going up through the summer. Then, in October 1929, it crashed. People who had been millionaires lost everything. The few who had listened to Cayce kept their fortunes. He talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls decades before they were discovered. In readings from the 1930s, he described ancient texts hidden in caves near the Dead Sea, texts that would change our understanding of early Christianity and Judaism. He said these scrolls would be found in the late 1940s and would cause scholars to reconsider much of what they thought they knew about the origins of Western religion. The scrolls were discovered in 1947, 3 years after Cayce's death, in caves near the Dead Sea, exactly as he described. They did indeed revolutionize biblical scholarship. He predicted the assassination of President Kennedy.
In a reading from the 1930s, he talked about a young leader, someone with great promise and charisma, who would be struck down at the height of his power. He said this leader would be from a prominent family, would be connected to the sea, and would fall in November. Kennedy, from the prominent Kennedy family of Massachusetts, a state known for its maritime history, was assassinated in November 1963. He predicted the State of Israel being established. In the 1930s, when Palestine was under British control and the idea of a Jewish state seemed impossible, Cayce described Jews returning to their homeland and establishing a nation. He said it would happen in the late 1940s and would cause decades of conflict. Israel was established in 1948, and the conflicts Cayce predicted continue to this day. He predicted medical treatments that didn't exist in his time but have since been proven effective. Doctors initially scoffed at his recommendations for things like electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, and certain herbal treatments. He talked about using light therapy for certain conditions, about the importance of proper diet and exercise, about the mind-body connection and healing. Today, many of these approaches are standard medical practice. Light therapy is used for seasonal affective disorder. Hydrotherapy is a recognized treatment modality. The mind-body connection is accepted by mainstream medicine. Statistical analysis of Cayce's predictions shows an accuracy rate far beyond random chance. Researchers at Duke University, at the University of Virginia, at other major institutions have studied his readings. They've calculated the probability of him getting so many specific details correct purely by guessing. They've run the numbers through computer models, analyzed the hits versus the misses, looked at the specificity of correct predictions versus vague ones. The numbers don't lie. The probability of Cayce achieving his documented accuracy rate by chance is essentially zero. Something extraordinary was happening when Cayce entered his trance state. So when Cayce made predictions about America's future, people paid attention, and the predictions about the 2020s, specifically about November 2026, are among the most detailed he ever gave. He didn't mention Trump by name. How could he? Trump wasn't born until 1946, a year after Cayce died. But he described something else. He described a pattern, a type of leader who would emerge during America's darkest hour. A builder, he called him, someone associated with towers and gold, someone who would promise to restore greatness, but whose second term would trigger the very crisis he claimed he would prevent. Think about that for a moment. Trump's entire brand is built on towers. Trump Tower in New York City, rising above Fifth Avenue with its golden facade, his name in huge golden letters on buildings across the world, the golden elevators in his apartment, the gold-plated fixtures.
The symbolism of reaching toward the sky, of building monuments to success, of accumulating wealth and displaying it ostentatiously. His whole life has been about building towers, about putting his name on the skyline. Cayce described this exact archetype in readings given in the 1940s, before Trump's father, Fred, had even started his real estate business in Queens. But the symbolism goes deeper. In reading 602-3, given in 1938, Cayce described something he called the judgment of the builders. He said that in the mid-2020s, those who had built their fortunes on questionable foundations would face a reckoning. Legal challenges, public scrutiny, a moment when everything they built would be tested, when the foundations would be examined and found wanting. Does this sound familiar? Trump has faced more legal challenges than any former president in history. Multiple indictments in multiple jurisdictions, criminal charges related to business practices, to handling of classified documents, to attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Civil cases involving fraud, defamation, sexual assault allegations. Accusations that have split the nation down the middle, with half the country seeing him as persecuted and the other half seeing him as a criminal who escaped justice for too long. Cayce said this reckoning would reach its peak in November 2026. Not just legal trouble, but something bigger, a constitutional crisis unlike anything America had seen before. And here's what makes it shocking. Cayce said this crisis would happen while the leader was in office, creating a situation with no precedent in American history. A sitting president facing criminal prosecution, facing removal, facing a choice between stepping down or fighting to stay in power by any means necessary. Let me paint you the picture Cayce described. According to his readings, the controversial leader would return to power after a period of defeat and exile. This return would be seen by his supporters as vindication, as proof that they were right all along. The first year would seem to confirm this. Economic numbers might look good, stock market might be up, unemployment might be down, certain campaign promises might appear to be kept. There would be what Cayce called a false dawn, a brief period where people thought everything was working, where supporters felt their faith had been rewarded, and critics began to doubt their opposition. But underneath, cracks would be forming. The policies implemented would carry hidden costs that wouldn't show up in the immediate data. International relations, already strained, would fray further. Allies would question American commitments. Rivals would test boundaries. The divisions in America would deepen, not heal. Political discourse would become more toxic, not less. Violence would simmer closer to the surface. Trust in institutions would erode further. Then, in 2026, everything would converge.
Cayce described 3 crises hitting almost simultaneously, each feeding off the others, creating a cascade effect that would overwhelm the nation's ability to respond. First, an economic shock. He called it the crumbling of false foundations, a moment when systems built on debt and speculation would collapse. He said this would be triggered by something related to international trade, to alliances breaking down, to the global order that had existed since World War II finally shattering. Think about Trump's plans for massive tariffs. He's promised to impose tariffs of 20% or more on all imports, up to 60% on goods from China. Economists warn this could trigger a global trade war, could spike inflation, could throw the American economy into recession. But Trump insists it will bring manufacturing back, will strengthen America, will force other countries to negotiate better deals. Cayce said the leader's own policies would inadvertently trigger the crisis he promised to prevent. The tariffs would spark retaliation. Other countries would impose their own tariffs on American goods. Supply chains that took decades to build would break. Companies that relied on global trade would fail. Jobs would be lost, prices would spike, and the promised manufacturing renaissance wouldn't materialize because the damage to the overall economy would be too severe. Cayce saw this economic crisis hitting in early 2026, probably in the first few months of the year. He described markets collapsing, not just stocks, but bonds and real estate too. He saw the dollar, which had been the world's reserve currency since World War II, suddenly facing credible alternatives. Countries that had held dollars and dollar-denominated assets would start dumping them, accelerating the dollar's decline. Interest rates would spike as the government struggled to finance its debt. The whole house of cards would start to fall. The second crisis would be environmental. Cayce was famous for his predictions about earth changes, about natural disasters increasing in frequency and intensity. He specifically mentioned the East Coast of America facing water-related catastrophes in the mid-2020s. He described flooding, extreme storms, what he called the sea claiming what man had built. He connected this directly to leadership that ignored environmental warnings, that prioritized short-term economic gains over long-term survival. Whether you believe in climate change or not, whether you think it's man-made or natural, Cayce's readings suggest that in 2026, nature would respond in ways that couldn't be ignored or denied. He saw major flooding along the Atlantic coast, particularly around New York, Washington, D.C., and Miami. He described storms of unprecedented power, infrastructure failing, millions of people displaced.
And he said this would happen at the worst possible time, when the economic crisis was already straining government resources, when the nation was least able to respond effectively. Think about Trump's environmental policies. He's promised to expand oil drilling, to roll back emissions regulations, to pull out of international climate agreements. He's called climate change a hoax, said environmental regulations kill jobs. His administration would prioritize economic development over environmental protection. And Cayce suggested that by 2026, the consequences of this approach would manifest in dramatic and undeniable ways. But the third crisis is the one that keeps researchers awake at night. Cayce described a constitutional crisis, a moment when the very foundations of American democracy would be questioned. He saw a scenario where the leader would refuse to accept limitations on his power, where he would claim that emergency conditions required extraordinary measures, where he would position himself as the only person who could save the nation from the chaos. He described institutions clashing, the executive branch against the legislative, the federal government against the states, the military caught in the middle, unsure which orders to follow. He saw the American people being forced to choose between security and freedom, between order and liberty, between a strong leader who promised to fix everything and the messy uncertainty of democracy. Write in the comments what you think about prophecies. Do you believe they can be true, or is it all just coincidence? Here's where Cayce got specific in a way that's almost frightening. He described a trigger event in November 2026, something that would happen during the midterm elections, but not the elections themselves. An action taken by the leader, something he saw as necessary to prevent disaster, but that half the country would view as tyrannical, as the moment democracy died. Cayce said this single action would push America to the brink of internal conflict. What could this action be? Cayce didn't spell it out directly, but he gave clues scattered across multiple readings. In one, he mentioned martial law being declared in major cities. In another, he talked about the military being deployed domestically, about soldiers patrolling American streets. In a third, he described a contested election result where the leader refused to accept the outcome, where he claimed fraud and used emergency powers to stay in office. In yet another reading, he described something about communication systems being shut down, about the government controlling information flow, about people unable to get reliable news because channels had been closed or compromised. He talked about arrests of opposition figures, about journalists being detained, about protesters being met with force. Put these pieces together and you start to see a scenario.
The midterm elections of November 2026 look like they're going to be a repudiation of the administration. The economic crisis has hit hard. People are suffering. The environmental disasters have been devastating. The polls suggest massive losses for the president's party, losses that would mean investigations, impeachment proceedings, perhaps even criminal prosecution. So the leader, seeing this coming, takes action. Maybe he declares a national emergency and postpones the elections. Maybe he claims there's evidence of foreign interference or domestic terrorism that requires extraordinary measures. Maybe he uses executive orders to bypass Congress, to concentrate power, to neutralize opposition. And when challenged, when the courts or Congress or the states push back, he escalates. He deploys the military, claiming he's protecting American security. He shuts down or censors media outlets he claims are spreading disinformation. He arrests people he claims are threats to national security. His supporters see him as a strong leader doing what's necessary to save America from chaos. His opponents see him as a tyrant destroying democracy. And the nation fractures. Some states comply with his orders, others refuse. Some military units follow his commands, others don't. Some Americans take to the streets in protest, others take to the streets to support him. And suddenly, America is on the edge of something it hasn't faced since 1861. But here's what most people miss when they hear about these prophecies. Cayce wasn't predicting inevitable doom. He was showing probable outcomes based on current trajectories. He emphasized repeatedly that human free will could change the future. The point of prophecy, he said, wasn't to scare people or to make him seem powerful. It was to warn people so different choices could be made, so awareness could shift the trajectory before it was too late. This is crucial to understand. Cayce believed the future wasn't fixed. It wasn't written in stone.
It was a field of probabilities, and the probability that manifested depended on the choices people made. Every decision, every action, every thought even, contributed to which timeline became real. The prophecies were warnings, guideposts, showing where things were headed if nothing changed. But change was always possible. Now let me tell you about something Cayce discussed that most researchers overlook. In reading 3976-18, he described what he called the unexpected ally. During the crisis of November 2026, when things looked darkest, when the nation seemed on the verge of tearing itself apart, a figure would emerge from an unexpected place. Not a traditional politician, not someone who had been building a political career for decades, someone who had stayed out of politics until the crisis forced them to step in. Cayce called this person a healer, someone with a background in bringing people together, in finding common ground, in building bridges.
He said this figure would offer a third path forward, something neither Republicans nor Democrats expected, something outside the left-right paradigm that had dominated American politics for so long. And according to Cayce, this person would begin to unite people by focusing on practical solutions rather than ideological battles, by addressing people's actual needs rather than playing political games. The question researchers are asking now is simple. Who could this be? Is it someone we already know? Someone already in public life but not currently in politics? Is it a business leader, a religious figure, a military officer, a scientist? Or is it someone who hasn't emerged yet, someone the crisis itself will reveal? Cayce gave characteristics, but no name. A healer, someone trusted by people across the political spectrum, someone with no obvious political ambition who steps forward only because the nation needs them. Some researchers think it might be someone from the military, a general or admiral respected by both sides who calls for calm and offers a path through the crisis that involves both sides stepping back from the brink. Others think it might be a governor, someone who has successfully led their state through difficulties and who other governors, both Republican and Democrat, respect enough to follow. Still others think it might be someone completely outside government, maybe a business leader or tech entrepreneur who has the resources and credibility to offer solutions the government can't. Whoever it is, Cayce said they would emerge in late 2026, after the crisis has begun but before it has spiraled completely out of control. They would offer a way forward that saves America from the worst outcomes. But Cayce also said this person couldn't do it alone. They would need popular support, people across the country choosing to follow this third path instead of continuing to fight. The healer could offer the way, but the people had to choose to take it. If you're finding this fascinating, if these connections are making you see current events in a new light, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Things are moving fast, and you don't want to miss what comes next. The next 12 months are going to be crucial, and you need to stay informed about what's developing. And if this video is giving you a different perspective on what's coming, leave a like. It helps more people find this information, helps spread awareness at a time when awareness might be the very thing that changes the outcome. Let's talk about timing. Why November 2026 specifically? Why not some other month, some other year? Cayce used astrological cycles in his readings. He wasn't an astrologer in the traditional sense, didn't cast horoscopes or make sun sign predictions, but he understood that celestial bodies had gravitational and electromagnetic effects on Earth, and that these effects created cycles that influenced human affairs.
He noted that certain planetary alignments marked turning points for nations and leaders, moments when change became inevitable. Researchers who have analyzed his astrological references found something remarkable. Several major alignments converge in late 2026. Saturn, the planet Cayce associated with lessons and limitations, forms a challenging aspect to Uranus, the planet of sudden change and revolution.
Pluto, the planet of death and transformation, completes its transit through a sign it's been in since 2008, the sign Cayce connected to America's identity and power. Neptune, the planet of dissolution and illusion, makes a critical aspect to the degree of the zodiac associated with America's founding. Specifically, a rare configuration occurs between August and November 2026. Astrologers call it a T-square, a pattern where three planets form challenging angles that create tension requiring release. Cayce associated this particular T-square pattern with the fall of leaders who overreach, who claim more power than they can hold, who refuse to bend and therefore break. This alignment happens in the signs of the zodiac Cayce connected to leadership, power structures, and revolution. It's the kind of alignment that occurs maybe once in a human lifetime, the kind that marks generations, that people remember decades later as the time when everything changed, and it peaks in November 2026. According to Cayce's framework, this alignment marks a point of no return. Not that everything is predetermined, but that the tension that's been building has to release somehow. The choice is not whether change happens, but how it happens, consciously and intentionally or chaotically and destructively, with awareness and preparation or with denial and resistance. He described it as a moment when time itself would seem to accelerate, when events that would normally take years would unfold in weeks or days. A compression point, he called it, a moment when history speeds up, when the normal rules don't seem to apply, when yesterday's impossible becomes today's reality. What would this look like in practical terms? Imagine waking up one morning in early November 2026 and the news is reporting that markets have crashed overnight, that trading has been halted, that the Federal Reserve has taken emergency measures. The same day, reports come in of massive flooding along the Atlantic coast, a storm that forecasters somehow missed, millions of people evacuating. And by evening, the president is on television announcing a national emergency, invoking powers no president has used since the Civil War. In the chaos and shock, normal patterns break. People can't process it fast enough. The news cycle, usually so rapid, can't keep up. Rumors spread faster than facts. People don't know what to believe. And in that space, that moment of collective disorientation, everything becomes fluid. Old rules don't hold. Old assumptions don't work.
People are forced to drop their preconceptions and deal with reality as it is, not as they thought it was. And in that space, according to Cayce, something new could emerge. New ways of organizing society, new leadership structures, new economic models that didn't rely on the old systems. He described it as birth pains, the necessary discomfort that comes before new life emerges. The caterpillar dissolving in the chrysalis before reforming as a butterfly, the necessary destruction that precedes creation. But Cayce was also clear about the danger. He said that in moments of crisis, people become vulnerable to authoritarian solutions. Fear makes people willing to trade freedom for the promise of security. Uncertainty makes them willing to follow anyone who seems confident and strong. Chaos makes them willing to accept limitations on liberty they would never have accepted in normal times. He warned that in November 2026, this temptation would be stronger than ever. The crisis would be severe enough that people would be desperate. The leader would present himself as the only one who could restore order. He would promise to fix everything if people just trusted him, just gave him the power he needed, just stopped questioning and started obeying. And many people, frightened and overwhelmed, would be tempted to accept. Cayce said resisting this temptation would require tremendous courage from ordinary citizens. It would require people to hold on to their principles even when afraid, to defend liberty even when security seemed more important,
to trust democratic processes even when they seemed too slow or uncertain, to believe in each other even when authority figures told them not to trust anyone. The role of Donald Trump in all this, according to Cayce's framework, it is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy and complexity. He's not the villain or the hero in this story. He's the catalyst, the force that brings everything to a head, that makes visible what was hidden, that forces issues that could have been ignored to be confronted. Cayce might say that Trump's soul agreed to play this role before incarnating, that he's fulfilling a karmic purpose for the nation whether he consciously knows it or not. In this view, everything that happens, even the painful parts, even the parts that seem destructive, serves the evolution of American consciousness. Trump exposes the corruption in the system by being part of it. He reveals the weakness of institutions by testing them. He shows the depth of divisions by widening them. He makes undeniable what could have been rationalized away. And through this exposure, through this crisis, America has the opportunity to evolve, to choose something better, to rebuild on stronger foundations. What happens to Trump personally in November 2026? This is where Cayce's readings become almost Shakespearean in their tragic complexity.
He described the leader facing his own moment of truth, a point where he must choose between ego and service, between holding on to power and allowing transformation, between being the tyrant he's accused of being or being the patriot he claims to be. The choice this leader makes, according to Cayce, determines whether the transition is relatively smooth or catastrophically chaotic. It's the hinge on which everything turns. And Cayce saw two possibilities, two timelines that could manifest depending on this choice. In one timeline, the leader steps back at the crucial moment. When the crisis hits, when he faces the choice between escalating or de-escalating, between grabbing more power or relinquishing it, he chooses to step back. He recognizes, perhaps with the help of trusted advisors, perhaps through his own moment of clarity, that his role was to expose the cracks in the foundation, not to rule over the reconstruction. He accepts that his time is over, that what's needed now is healing, not fighting, unity, not division, and he allows new leadership to emerge. In this timeline, the crisis of November 2026 is sharp but brief. The economic shock happens, the environmental disaster occurs, the constitutional crisis begins, but it doesn't spiral out of control because the leader, at the critical moment, doesn't fuel it further. He steps aside. He calls for calm. He accepts the limits on his power. And America, shaken but intact, begins to work through the crisis together. In the other timeline, the leader refuses to step back. He sees the crisis not as evidence that he should relinquish power, but as proof that he needs more power to fix things. He sees the challenges not as limits he should respect, but as obstacles he must overcome by any means necessary. He takes actions that his supporters see as strong and necessary, but that his opponents see as tyrannical and unconstitutional. And in this timeline, the crisis deepens. What starts in November 2026 cascades into something darker, something that takes years to resolve. The nation fractures further, violence escalates, institutions break, the economy spirals, and by the time things stabilize, America has been fundamentally changed, traumatized, divided, perhaps beyond repair. The rebuilding that eventually happens starts from a much lower, much more damaged foundation. Which timeline are we on? Cayce said that wouldn't be clear until the moment itself. The future remains fluid until the choice point is reached. Multiple possibilities exist simultaneously, until consciousness collapses them into one reality. But he gave one more clue. He said that the leader's decision would be influenced by the consciousness of the people around him. If enough voices call for restraint, for wisdom, for stepping back from the brink, if enough people he trusts tell him it's time to let go, if enough of his supporters say they want peace more than victory, that possibility becomes more real.
The timeline where he steps back gains probability. But if voices call for strength, for doubling down, for never surrendering, if people around him encourage escalation, if his supporters demand he fight to the end, that possibility strengthens instead. The timeline where the crisis deepens gains probability. This brings us back to something fundamental. Cayce believed that ordinary people hold extraordinary power. The future isn't written by leaders and governments alone. It's written by the daily choices of millions of individuals. Every act of kindness, every bridge built across divides, every moment of clarity and compassion shifts the collective field. Every choice for peace over violence, for truth over lies, for unity over division, tips the scales. The consciousness of the people creates the reality the people experience. If Americans choose fear, they get a fearful future. If they choose love, they get a loving future. If they choose division, they get a divided future. If they choose unity, they get a unified future. It's not mystical or magical. It's how consciousness works, how the field of probability responds to intention and attention. Let me tell you about one more reading that's particularly relevant. In 1944, just months before his death, Cayce was asked about violence in America's future. The question came from someone worried about civil unrest, about the potential for Americans to turn on each other. And Cayce, in his trance state, described a period when the nation would come close to internal conflict, when armed factions would face each other in American streets, when the military would be forced to make a choice about which side to support, which orders to follow. He said this wasn't inevitable, but was a very real possibility depending on the choices leaders made and the consciousness the people held. The trigger point, according to Cayce, would be in November of the year he'd been describing, when a contested action by the leader would push the nation to the brink. He described troops in the streets of major cities, not due to foreign invasion, but due to internal breakdown. National Guard units activated, federal forces deployed, a nation at war with itself. He saw this as a fork-in-the-road moment where America would either pull back from the edge or plunge into chaos. The choice would be made in real time, in the heat of the moment, by thousands of people making individual decisions about how to respond. Would protesters remain peaceful, or would they turn violent? Would police show restraint, or would they escalate? Would military officers follow orders they believed were unconstitutional, or would they refuse? Would ordinary citizens intervene to de-escalate, or would they stand aside and let violence happen? But in the same breath, Cayce described a path through. He spoke of a spiritual awakening emerging from the crisis, of people remembering what truly matters,
of communities coming together across political divides because survival demanded cooperation, of individuals reaching out to neighbors they'd been taught to hate and finding common humanity. He said the crisis of November 2026 would ultimately serve to unite rather than divide, but only after things got much worse before they got better. Think about that phrase, worse before better. It's the story of transformation, of metamorphosis, of rebirth. The caterpillar doesn't peacefully transition into a butterfly. It dissolves completely in the chrysalis, its entire body breaking down into a soup of undifferentiated cells before reforming as something new. It looks like death, but it's actually
transformation. Cayce suggested America would go through something similar in November 2026, a breakdown that looked like ending but was actually beginning. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Can we trust these predictions? How do we know Cayce wasn't just making educated guesses? How do we know researchers aren't reading meaning into vague statements after the fact, seeing what they want to see? These are fair questions. These are questions anyone should ask when hearing about prophecy. And the answer lies in Cayce's track record with predictions that have already come true, that can be verified, that were documented before the events occurred. He predicted both world wars before they started, describing details about alliances and conflict patterns that didn't exist when he made the predictions. In 1935, when most Americans were isolationist, when the idea of another European war seemed remote, Cayce described Germany, under a strongman leader, invading neighboring countries. He described Japan attacking American interests in the Pacific. He described a conflict that would draw in the entire world, that would last years, that would end with new weapons of incredible destructive power. He said the war would start in 1939 and end in the mid-1940s. 4 years later, it happened exactly as he said. He predicted the assassination of President Kennedy.
In a reading from the 1930s, more than 20 years before Kennedy entered politics, Cayce talked about a young leader, someone with great promise and charisma, who would be struck down at the height of his power. He said this leader would be from a prominent family, would have connections to the sea, would represent hope and change, and would fall in November. Kennedy, from the prominent Kennedy family of Massachusetts, a state with deep maritime traditions, the youngest elected president, a symbol of a new generation, was assassinated in November 1963. The parallels to Cayce's reading are unmistakable. He predicted the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In readings from the 1930s, Cayce described ancient texts hidden in caves near the Dead Sea. He said these scrolls contained writings that would change our understanding of Judaism and Christianity, that would reveal knowledge thought lost, that would challenge established religious doctrines. He said they would be found in the late 1940s. The scrolls were discovered in 1947, 3 years after Cayce's death, in caves near the Dead Sea in the region now called Qumran. They contained Hebrew texts over 2,000 years old, including versions of biblical books older than any previously known. They revolutionized biblical scholarship, exactly as Cayce predicted. He predicted medical treatments and technologies that didn't exist in his time, but have since been proven effective and are now standard practice. Doctors in the 1920s and 1930s scoffed at his recommendations. They called him a quack. They said his treatments had no scientific basis. But decades later, medical science caught up to what Cayce had been saying. He recommended electrotherapy for certain conditions. Doctors said that was nonsense. Now, electrical stimulation is used for pain management, muscle rehabilitation, and treating certain neurological conditions. He recommended hydrotherapy, using water at different temperatures to treat various ailments. Doctors dismissed it. Now, hydrotherapy is a recognized treatment modality taught in medical schools. He talked about using light therapy for seasonal depression. Doctors said that was ridiculous. Now, light therapy is the standard treatment for seasonal affective disorder. He described the importance of diet in treating disease, saying that certain foods could heal while others could harm. The medical establishment of his time believed diet had little to do with health beyond basic nutrition. Now we know that diet affects everything from heart disease to cancer to mental health. He talked about the mind-body connection, about how thoughts and emotions affected physical health. Doctors said that was mystical nonsense. Now mind-body medicine is an established field with research backing it up. He prescribed combinations of herbs and supplements for various conditions. Pharmacologists said these combinations had no scientific rationale.
But when researchers later studied some of these combinations, they found they did work, often in ways that made sense once the mechanisms were understood. Cayce somehow knew what would work decades before science could explain why. Statistical analysis of Cayce's predictions shows an accuracy rate far beyond what random chance could produce. Researchers at Duke University in North Carolina, at the University of Virginia, at other major institutions have studied his readings over the decades. They've categorized them, analyzed them, checked them against outcomes. They've calculated the probability of him getting so many specific details correct purely by guessing. They've run the numbers through computer models. They've analyzed the hits versus the misses. They looked at the specificity of correct predictions versus vague ones. They've checked whether he was just making obvious extrapolations from known trends or whether he was truly accessing information he shouldn't have had. And the verdict is clear. The numbers don't lie. The probability of Cayce achieving his documented accuracy rate by chance is essentially zero. Something extraordinary was happening when Cayce entered his trance state. He was accessing information in ways that science still doesn't fully understand. So when this same man, with this documented track record, makes specific predictions about November 2026, researchers pay attention. When someone who correctly predicted 2 world wars, a stock market crash, a presidential assassination, and countless medical breakthroughs says something specific is going to happen in a specific month, it's worth taking seriously. And when you line up what he predicted with what's actually happening in American politics right now in October 2025, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Let me walk you through some of these parallels point by point. Cayce predicted a controversial builder would return to power after a period of defeat. Trump won the 2024 election, returning to the White House after his 2020 defeat. That's parallel number 1. Cayce predicted this leader would face unprecedented legal challenges while in office, challenges that would come to a head during his second term. Trump is the first former president to be indicted, facing multiple criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions even as he governs. Legal proceedings are ongoing, trials are scheduled, and the question of how to prosecute a sitting president is creating constitutional crises that courts are struggling to navigate. That's parallel number 2. Cayce predicted the nation would be more divided than ever, with political polarization reaching extreme levels not seen since the Civil War. According to polling from October 2025, Americans are more politically divided now than at any point in modern history. Families are split over politics, friendships have ended, communities are fractured, political violence is increasing. The center has collapsed. That's parallel number 3. Cayce predicted economic policies that would seem successful at first but would carry hidden costs that would manifest in the mid-2020s. Trump has promised and begun implementing massive tariffs and trade renegotiations. In early 2025, stock markets rallied on hopes these policies would boost American manufacturing. But economists are warning that the costs will show up in 2026 as inflation spikes, supply chains break, and trading partners retaliate. That's parallel number 4. Cayce predicted international alliances would fracture, that the global order that had existed since World War II would break apart. Trump has questioned America's commitments to NATO, has threatened to withdraw from mutual defense pacts, has renegotiated trade agreements in ways that have angered allies. European leaders are openly discussing a future without American leadership. Asian allies are hedging their bets. The international system is more fragile than it's been in 80 years. That's parallel number 5. Cayce predicted natural disasters would increase in frequency and intensity during this period, particularly affecting the East Coast. Climate events have accelerated beyond what models predicted. In 2025, we've seen record-breaking storms, unprecedented flooding, wildfires that are larger and more destructive than ever before. The East Coast has been hit particularly hard with hurricane seasons that seem to have no end, with flooding that overwhelms infrastructure built for a different climate. That's parallel number 6. Cayce predicted the dollar would face challenges to its supremacy, that other countries would begin to move away from it as the reserve currency. In 2025, the BRICS nations – Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa – have accelerated efforts to create alternative systems. They're trading in their own currencies, creating new institutions to bypass the dollar-dominated system. The dollar is still dominant, but less so than a year ago, and the trend is accelerating. That's parallel number 7. The pieces are aligning. The pattern Cayce described is manifesting. The timeline he laid out in the 1940s matches what we're seeing in 2025. And we're now less than a year away from November 2026, the month he circled as the critical point, the moment when everything converges, the fork in the road, where America chooses one future or another. But here's what gives me hope in all this. Cayce also predicted what comes after. He didn't just see crisis, he saw transformation through crisis. He said that what would appear to be disaster would actually be the necessary catalyst for America's evolution. The old systems needed to die so new ones could emerge. The false foundations needed to be exposed so real ones could be built. The comfortable illusions needed to be shattered so difficult truths could be faced.
He said that after the crisis of November 2026, America would emerge renewed, not destroyed, but transformed, changed fundamentally, but in ways that would ultimately be positive. He saw a period beginning around 2027 or 2028 where new systems would take root, where a different kind of leadership would emerge, leadership based on service rather than ego, on cooperation rather than domination, on wisdom rather than just power. Where Americans would rediscover their common humanity, would remember that they had more in common with each other than they had differences. Where the focus would shift from ideology to practical problem-solving, from fighting each other to fixing problems together. He described this period as a new dawn, a renaissance of sorts. New forms of energy would become viable. New economic models would emerge that didn't require endless growth and consumption. New political structures would develop that were more responsive to people's needs. New technologies would be developed and deployed in ways that served humanity rather than just profit. The crisis wasn't the end of the story. It was the turning point, the necessary breakdown that preceded breakthrough, the death that preceded rebirth. Cayce talked about young leaders emerging after the crisis, not politicians in the traditional sense, not people who had spent decades climbing party hierarchies, but people who had lived through the chaos and learned from it. People who had experienced the breakdown of the old systems and had insights about how to build new ones. People who cared more about solutions than ideology. Who could speak to both sides because they understood both sides. Who could unite because they weren't invested in division. He saw a generation shaped by the crisis of 2026 who would rebuild America on stronger foundations. These would be people who came of age during the chaos, who learned early that the old ways didn't work, who weren't attached to institutions that had failed. They would be pragmatic, creative, collaborative, and they would lead America into a new era starting in the late 2020s and into the 2030s.
He also predicted technological breakthroughs that would come from the crisis. Throughout history, necessity has driven innovation. Crisis creates conditions where old assumptions are questioned, where new approaches are tried, where breakthrough becomes possible because the old way is no longer an option. Cayce said that by 2030, America would look very different from 2025, but in ways that most people would ultimately see as positive. New forms of energy that had been suppressed or ignored would suddenly become viable and widespread. He talked about what we might now call clean energy, renewable energy, free energy systems, new ways of organizing communities that were more resilient and sustainable, new economic